Ready? And
roll camera.
rolling.
Action.
Okay. What fundamental arguments would you put in favour of the free market and individual liberty?
I think when you look at the question of individual liberty, a new generation has emerged in recent years who support the ideas that you find in the literature of traditional classical liberalism. I think that if you're looking at the radical free marketeers, if you're looking at the libertarian movement, whatever you want to call it, the new right, you've got to understand that the people who have emerged in recent years are living in a very different world to the one that went before. You're living in the world of the Boeing 747, the satellite communication systems. You're living in a world that's a long way away from the nation-statism of the 19th century. And I think that traditionally people have been measured according to collective criteria. Hitler is always regarded as right-wing. I think to the people that I've been studying on the new right or the libertarian right or whatever you want, Hitler is extremely left-wing. He's another collectivist. You see, I think that the ideas of individual liberty are important to this new generation because they don't like to measure people according to collective criteria, sex, race, class. They like to measure people according to their individual ability, to how hard they want to work, to their creativity, to things like that, things which are innate within human beings. And so I think we've seen the rise of a new generation. This is very difficult for people on the traditional left to understand. I think for many years the left have been stuck with the worldview that the new right surely must be racist, surely they must be sexist. And it really explains how throughout the early 1980s the Labour Party and the left in general were increasingly out of touch with reality. It was always fascinating for me. In the early 1980s, the Labour Party would accuse people in the Conservative Party and on the new right, or the classical liberal wing, if you will, of being racist. But it was when the Conservative Party privatised, for example, water, and it sold a percentage of the shares to the French, that the Labour Party went up in arms. And they said, you can't do this, they're French. The Labour Party in reality are stuck in measuring people according to collective criteria. And this simply is not compatible with a world that has technology and a global economic system where people are increasingly being measured according to individual ability.
Thank you. What has been the main areas of your study as a PhD student?
Well, there have been a number of academics. Sorry, I'm going to start again.
Is that a good question?
Just
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Perhaps we always point to it. I think we point out that you did that fine last one. Just the only thing is that if Martin asks a question, the way we're doing is if you can answer in complete sentences, in the sense that the question from the interviewer will not actually come in. So if it makes sense on its own, for instance, if Martin asks that question, you would then ask, as a PhD student,
that's why I stopped. Yeah, right, exactly.
That's fine.
Yeah,
you're doing great though. Anyway.
I just thought the word student was a little bit.
Yes, I was going to say, as an academic who's been studying the new right, the libertarian right, in recent years, I guess that in Britain, I probably have a better idea of who these people are. Especially who the young generation are, who the emerging generation are, than anybody else. A number of academics have studied, for example, the youth wings of the Conservative Party, who are renowned for having a far more free market attitude than their elders and betters in the party. But I'm the only person who's actually done some serious statistical work and really immersed myself in the culture to really get to grips with it. For example, I've got over 1,000 newspaper articles on this movement. I've got virtually all their publications at regional and national level from these organisations over the last 12 years. And I've interviewed many, many hundreds of people involved. So I think I have, with my work, got a pretty good academic idea of what's going on. And the reality is that for the vast bulk of the young new right, the left were simply devoid of any way ahead, of really any understanding of or any vision for the future. The left were stuck in the old politics of class. And again, they hark on about collective criteria like race and sex. And they don't really have the economic understanding on how to get to this utopian world. For me, if you want to understand the new right, the people I've been studying, then you've got to probably ask the same questions that Marx asked. I notice that all the youngsters I've been looking at are asking virtually identical questions to him. They look at power in society, the role of the state. They're interested in the sociological features. But the conclusions that they reach, the answers that they give, are derived from classical liberal thought. More than that, I think they're heavily influenced by traditional anarchist schools. It was interesting for me to discover that most of the young new right were not simply very well read, with people like Proudhon and Bakunin on the socialist anarchist movement of the latter part of the last century, but they were incredibly well read on the individualist anarchist material, people like Josiah Warren, Spooner, Benjamin Tucker, and others. And more than that, I think this is a crucial thing, they're very influenced by some quite anarchic thinkers of the 20th century, particularly Ayn Rand in America, who for them I think is the greatest philosopher ever. People like Murray Rothbard, again a modern anarchist, and people like Hayek and Friedman and Nozick and the people that most academics in Britain have heard of. But to return to the crucial point, it was the conclusion of my work that if you want to demarcate between the traditionally minded conservatives and the radical free marketeers, the people who would like to see the privatization of roads, people who are opposed to nationalism and patriotism, people who favor a global economy with international free migration of capital, property and labor, then you really have to understand the traditional anarchist schools.
Thank you. What is the Adam Smith Institute? And could you describe your work with the ASI?
Okay, now I don't want to, I will answer another question,
Right.
but I will reword my answer, okay.
Right.
I think that when you look at the pressure groups that surround the new right, and I'm talking about things like the Adam Smith Institute, the Institute of Economic Affairs, many others, smaller groups like the Libertarian Alliance, it's interesting to note that they are dominated by people who have at their heart a great deal of anti-statist and free market thinking. And really, with the exception of the Tory reform group, I don't know any pressure groups who sort of are involved in the British right, if I use that term purely for the sake of communication, who are influential. It's as if the left wing of the Conservative Party, the Wets and the statists and the nationalists, are pessimistic about the future, and they've given up thinking about ideas. I think the most interesting thing that I discovered with my research into the new right was how interested these young people are in books. It was the old cliche, wasn't it, that the left liked to do all the thinking in the late 1960s and they were the intellectuals. I think there's been a huge switch with that. and you're far more likely to find a young libertarian stuck behind a book than anywhere else. And they're interestingly far better read these days in Das Kapital and all the literature of Marx and the left than the so-called Marxist or socialist left. But I do think that that the groups that surround the Conservative Party have been hugely influential in the development of the new right, and that process is continuing. As the years go by, we're seeing the development of ever more radical free market groups, and who are having an ever bigger impact on the development of certainly the youth groups. And of course, it follows on from that, doesn't it, that we must be seeing the change, therefore, in generational terms, in the nature of the Conservative Party. I think the old Conservative Party that was based upon deference to the aristocracy, patriotism, sense of duty, that was fine and very understandable, given a world of the nation state and given the world as it was emerging from a feudal time. Today the world's economy is globalizing. We have international free migration, I think increasingly likely in Europe. We have a global technology, we have fax machines, we have communication that states can no longer control, and if they attempt to, then they lose out economically. And I think that the thinking that these youngsters are doing is attempting to get to grips with that world. So it's fascinating for me, and that's why I enjoyed studying it.
Thank you. How did you become economic and political advisor to the Slovakian Prime Minister?
Right, now if I answer that point,
Yeah.
that is going to make me seem to be more of an activist than I want to be. Because I'll then come out of the closet and I'll say, well, I'm not just the academic studying this,
Right.
and therefore providing from the London School of Economics point of view the reasonable middle ground. It'll be I'm a troublemaker who's a plant. Do you follow? So, I mean, I understand. What we can do, what would be better, would be to ask Antoine,
Right.
how was it that he became the economic and political advisor to the finance minister in Slovakia, and what sort of ideas were he, what ideas was he promoting?
Mm-hmm.
And there, that would be, I think, even more fun, because Antoine will take, I know what he'll say. He'll say, I was telling the evils of taxation and how to have a minimal state. And if I say that, you'll detract from me being the academic, which is, I think that the big payoff is. Because the other academic in Britain who you'll get to talk about this is Ruth Levitas. She's a sociologist, and she's also written on the Federation of Conservative Students. And she talks out of her arsehole.
Right.
Yeah,
gotcha.
One question you might want to put to me, you might want to say, well, you might want to criticise me, you might want to say, well, if you look at the Federation of Conservative Students, Tim, surely they supported lots of totalitarian and very statist regimes like South Africa. And I think I could handle that quite easily, and I think that would be interesting.
It might be. The only problem is we're trying
Yeah.
to get away from looking too much at the Tory party.
Sure.
We've got, and we've had quite a long interview with Ian about
Yeah.
the Tory party, and that kind of issue we have covered
Right.
in quite a lot of detail. You see, we do want to avoid
Right.
party labels to some extent.
Yes. Yes.
If you understand
Well,
what I mean.
what I could do is I could talk about this generation as destroying, which they are,
Yeah.
as destroying party labels.
Yeah, okay.
And I'd be
that's
happy to do
fine.
that. And I think that's the importance of this work.
Sure.
I think
Okay.
So,
another thing. Okay, let's do that. And
Let's
then
do
perhaps
that.
after that, what we can do. Another thing, which I think we ought to do is
Yeah.
bear in mind this video is aimed to a number of people. One of the main groups is school kids
Yes.
who might be studying economics or politics, or
Yes.
students in colleges, universities, polytechnics, and so on, who might not be particularly well informed. I mean, perhaps if you could just give some really fundamental ideas,
Sure,
the fundamental
sure.
things, arguments for individual freedom, for
Yes.
private property, what are the consequences in terms of economics, politics, and so on. Let's
Sure,
talk about
I can
later.
do that,
In
okay.
the first place, let's talk about that other thing about
Okay. Okay, so the two questions I will answer, the one I'll do later will be, I'll say,
What's
I
after?
think at the core of
Yeah,
this generation,
that'd be great.
you have a number of ideas.
That's
For
good.
example, look at property right. I can handle it that way.
Great.
And before that, I can talk about the importance of this generation.
Yeah, that sounds great.
What will be their historical legacy? And I think it'll be that they will destroy the left-right paradigm.
Yeah, I think about getting rid of party labels. And
Yeah.
for me, you might want to mention the words left and right emerged after
Yes,
the French
yes,
Revolution, and
yes.
it was a question of where you sat in the
Yeah.
Chamber
Yeah,
of Deputies and
sure.
so on. And that's irrelevant for the modern world, or something like that. Just to
Yeah.
say that, because often people don't know that.
Yes.
They assume because left wing, right wing are such dominant ideas.
Yes.
If just to explain the historical origins of that term would be great.
Yes.
And just
I
say
think
how
it's usually quite good to talk about Hitler being right-wing. And I can say, and I'll explain, don't worry.
Yeah, do you want to just do that? I mean,
Yeah,
I'm
sure.
you know the history of the words left
Sure.
wing, right wing,
Sure.
and how they diverge.
Sure.
Just say how they're irrelevant in the modern world.
Sure. Okay.
Right.
Okay, roll camera,
Rolling.
action.
I think if you were looking for a major contribution that this generation has made and will continue to make in the future, then I think history will look back and it will say that these people destroyed the traditional left-right dichotomy. You see, most school children today think that Hitler was very right-wing, don't they? Because he was racist. The fact is that to the libertarians, Hitler was incredibly left-wing because he was statist and he was incredibly authoritarian. The basic line for the generation that is emerging is not some absurd left-right spectrum, but I think a new spectrum, a spectrum of authoritarian versus libertarian. And by that, the authoritarian statist groups who measure people according to collective criteria and want to impose policies based on collective ideas, as opposed to people who want to base their politics and their ideas on individual freedom, individual liberty, individual creativity, and the economic system, of course, that is most compatible with that, which is the radical free market. So I think that this is the major contribution of that generation. And we see it all around us. This week, Marxism Today closed down. The Communist Party of Great Britain renamed itself, I think, the Party of the Democratic Left. This was a week where I asked a friend of mine who's in the Labour Party, I said, what do you think socialism is about now? And she said, I think it's about bringing people together through trade. This was remarkable for me, because I see there, if she really believes that, an incredible consensus with the so-called new right, a term that I hate. You see, I think the reality is that the communications of the world that we now live in, the fact that young people are exposed to so many different ideas on television, they have access to viewing so many different cultures, that the traditional ideas of left and right have been rendered meaningless. That the one thing that people are increasingly today is culturally tolerant. The Church of England know that they can no longer make massive collective pronouncements because many other people are influenced by Eastern religions or whatever. And I just think that the context and the technology of today has led to a new generation who really have the individual at their heart. And this is why, when you actually look at them, get away from the propaganda in the newspapers and actually look at the material of the libertarians, they are concerned about issues like sexuality, feminism, the freedom of ethnic minorities. And in many ways they parallel what has been the traditional left, but they see the solution to these problems being in the realms of the free market and individual property rights. I think that if you were to get to the core of free market ideas, really what motivates this generation, what their essential ideas are, they're based on some very important principles, which things like property rights. The basic idea is that, as Ayn Rand said, property rights are not just things about property. They're not just, whether you own a lamp or a table. She said, a man or a woman has no right to life if you haven't got the rights to the fruit of your own labour. Now, at the moment, I'm not paid particularly well, and I think I pay 25% tax. That means that for half of every Thursday and most of Friday each week, I earn money, but I don't have the right to the fruits of my own labour. That money is simply taken automatically by the state. It's coercive, because if I didn't take it, the police would come round. That money is removed, and it is given to other people. And you might say, well, that's fine, because of course, Tim, you are privileged enough to have a job, and what about the poor? Well, again, the problem is that, of course, if you have high taxation and you have high levels of welfare spending, you can actually build into a social system economic signals which encourage poverty. And I think this is the big lesson, certainly of Thatcherism, and the idea which motivates so many people on the libertarian right, or the libertarian movement. It's not that they're heartless, it's not that they're cruel, it's not that they're yuppies, it's not that they're anything like that, it's not that they're uncaring. It is quite simply that if you continue to build in economic signals which encourage poverty, if I said to you, okay, you're unemployed, I'm going to give you £150 a week to work, what would happen? You would probably remain unemployed. And you wouldn't have the motivation to contribute, to put products on the market, to use your own creativity. You would probably simply sit at home and vegetate. And if there was that money available on welfare, lots of other people would join you. And the problem with that, in turn, is that as we have traditionally increased welfare expenditure and we have created the dependency culture, so taxation has risen, and we are in a cycle where we now have hundreds of thousands of people who purport to be caring, but they're actually defending vested interests within the state. You can turn on your television any evening in Britain or anywhere in Europe at 6 o'clock, and you can watch your Thames News or your South East reports or your local news programme. And for 30 minutes I tell you how it will go. It'll start off, Barking Hospital today wants an extra £1 million because they're running out of resources. If we look to the north of our region today, the local community centre for ethnic minorities needs another £300,000. And so it goes on. And then you have lots of rather well-paid middle-class people who are professional agitators sitting there saying, yes, my cause is very important, I need the extra resources. And they have no idea of the damage they're doing. They have no idea that over time they're building in economic signals. They're expanding the state sector, they're burdening industry through ever higher taxation. If you look at the tax burden, it actually went up overall under Thatcher. The state increased. There's no comprehension of this, and where will it lead? And I think that's the question, that it's the heart of so many younger people in the libertarian movement. They're incredibly concerned about the poor. A lot of them are sociologists themselves, philosophy students, politics students, people who graduated in those subjects. And it's not that they're heartless, it's in fact that they're incredibly caring. And it's precisely because of that they don't want to simply see the state grow. And they don't like these middle-class vested interest groups milking the system and being so two-faced by pretending they're so caring, but not recognising the damage they're doing.
Yeah.
You see, whenever you do a programme and you have 10 different libertarians talking, the one question that the students will ask is, but what about the poor? I know this.
Yeah.
I know this. And so that's really why I wanted to get to grips with that and concentrate on that.
Sure.
And the size of the state. I could talk about life, liberty and property, but if you're going to be interviewing 10 or 12 people or 30 people or whatever, they're all going to be talking about that.
A lot of them, yeah.
And very few of our people outside are particularly good at talking about the poor and about the
It's a good point, important.
whenever you interview anyone, David, from Antoine Clark to Madison Peary, whoever,
Mm.
they're all going to be ranting and raving about life, liberty and property, you know, and the mechanisms of the free
You
market.
see, I think that's part of that is wrong. I think property is included in life. And I think the pursuit of happiness should be the area that eradicates the property. Property is just cardboard, you know. I think it should be the pursuit of happiness because that's contact.
Okay, roll camera.
Running.
Action.
I think there are 3 or 4 main principles that are being put forward by the libertarian, classical liberal generation. I think they can be characterized as life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. I think the first thing is life. Life is seen as being inherently good in itself, enjoyable, and that people should have the right to their own life. You might find that rather strange, because you might think, well, of course I have my own life. But do you really? For example, in modern Britain, this will be the question. If you have a terminal illness and you're in severe pain, and you decide that you can't stand it anymore and you want to terminate your life, under British law, you're not allowed to. So you don't really have your own life. And of course, the state can regulate and does regulate on all kinds of things that affect your life, on substances that you can take, on your choices about food, on many things, and this is very fashionable. So the first thing is the right to your own life. You control it. The second thing is liberty, and then the third thing, property. The reality is that there are 2 types of property, I think. The physical property, obviously, you should have the right to your own home and to things that you want and you choose, because they're part of your identity, and it's a fundamental right. But also you should have the right to the fruits of your own productive labour. I work and I pay 25% tax. That means I spend half of Thursday and Friday working for other people. Is that moral? To a lot of the generation I've been studying, it isn't moral, because they don't have the right to their own property, and therefore, in a sense, they're not truly individuals. They're just part of a grey mass, a collectivity. And following on from that, the pursuit of happiness. I don't think that any church or any state or any politician can judge really what is best for you or me. I think this is what the generation I've studied would say. It's up for people to pursue their own happiness. There are many things that make me happy that perhaps would make you very sad. There are certain countries I like which might make you sad, certain paintings that I might like that might make you sad. And it's very dangerous for a church or a state, or for politicians, to try and impose some sort of uniformity of rules across your tastes. So I think these are the principles that are at the heart of this generation. And going on from that, you've probably detected, you probably thought, well, are these right-wing ideas? It sounds very reasonable. Or are they left-wing ideas? The fact is they can't be characterized as being left or right. They're simply about measuring people as individuals and letting people live as individuals, both physically and morally.
Great. Okay. Now, what I was going to suggest perhaps next, should we say, well, what about the poor? I mean, we haven't really gone through that. I mean, let's say somebody says, well, it's great if you're a millionaire or something like that.
Yeah.
What about the poor?
I think what I can do is I could talk about the difference between the entrepreneur.
Yeah, that thing.
And the bureaucrat, because I think I have already talked about the poor.
You have talked about
Yeah,
that.
And I did that quite
Sure,
extensively.
yeah,
Sure.
yeah.
So,
Okay, what are the differences between the bureaucrats, the entrepreneur's approach to a problem, and the bureaucrat's approach to a problem?
Okay.
Still rolling?
Mm-hmm.
I think that one of the important ideas that is firmly set in the minds of the libertarian generation that's emerging is that they distinguish between the people who work for the states, let's call them, state bureaucrats, be they doctors, nurses, civil servants, whoever, we'll call them state bureaucrats, and people who are entrepreneurs. Let's look at what they do. Well, an entrepreneur, by definition, provides goods and services and is rewarded through profit. That means that if an entrepreneur... Do you want to do that again?
Can I turn that off? Look,
It's
it's
doing it.
smoking.
It's very strange. What is it smoking?
I just wonder if it's dusty, you know.
Do you want to turn it off or what? I think I'll be alright, I mean, to be honest.
It is actually smoking, but...
It's still smoking.
Well, we've got to swap bulbs, I mean, if we want to swap bulbs. So you want
Not
to turn that thing off?
smoking
or-
now.
I can't see what it
It's
is.
smoking now.
It's smoking now quite heavily.
Yeah.
Something is melting and dripping onto something, isn't it?
Perhaps I'll switch it off.
I mean, it may just be a bit of tape or something, or just heating up and dripping, I would think. Somebody has
Could be.
stuck something on it, or something's on there.
God, it's
I
really
think-
roasting away there.
I think we probably ought to just go until it conks out.
Yeah, let's do it. You don't own it, so you can.
Yeah, let's just go for a while
Yeah.
and see what happens.
Oh, yeah,
It
that's
may
it.
well just
Okay, I'll
fly
try and do
over.
this. Okay,
Yes, the bureaucrats. Should we go back from the top?
I'll go back from the top. Yeah, I'll go from the top as quickly as possible. If it catches fire, just tell me and I'll move.
Don't worry about it, we can always... we've got a
Well,
spare
pour beer
toilet.
over it or whatever.
Right.
I won't waste it on that. No, I think it's making too much noise.
What is it doing? I've never known that.
Look,
Sounds
I'll
like
tell you
someone having anal sex, doesn't it? Really?
Exactly.
I wouldn't know. Actually, but
No, I wouldn't know.
Well, no, nor would I. But
Shall I switch it off? And so then we can see what it is.
I can't see anything. I don't think it's happening inside the actual lamp case. I think it's on top of the
The
shielding.
I think that's going to be intrusive, the noise.
it will actually
I think that's right.
make people think I've got a lot of indigestion.
Let's have a look.
It doesn't smell though, does it?
Well done.
We haven't finished yet.
We've got just a last.
And
You know what the question's about?
What is the question?
Oh, hang on, right,
Hang on,
okay.
wait. Am I going to ask the question?
Well, maybe
Or
not.
would you-
Okay,
I know that. I know
What's the
this.
difference in a bureaucrat's approach to a problem, social problem, whatever, and an entrepreneur's approach to a problem?
Right.
Yeah, can you actually start on that?
I'll do that, yeah.
before the- Right.
If you're addressing the question of the fundamental difference between a state bureaucrat and an entrepreneur, which I think is a fundamental question because it's a question asked by most of the people I've been studying in the libertarian movement, then you have to start from the basic understanding that most individuals, of course, try to promote themselves, they try to have increased status, increased power, and progress their careers. But that there is a difference between the way people do this according to whether they're in the private or the state sector. An entrepreneur, by definition, has to provide people with goods and services at a price that they can afford and at a quality they want. Otherwise, they go out of business. They're brought up against the costs of their actions. They don't make a profit. Therefore, they don't have the better car, the better house, whatever they want. The other system, of course, is the state bureaucrat. These are people who are paid out of money that is not given voluntarily, but that is taken coercively. If you don't believe me, try and not pay your next tax bill. State bureaucrats are people who can only progress their careers by having bigger departments, bigger budgets, and more control. It's part of the dynamics of the organisation. Be this a member of the armed forces, state health system, a local welfare unit, a school. The dynamics of a state bureaucrat is that state bureaucracy is ever try to build power, to empire build, I think is the term that is used. And of course the result is that these people are never brought up against the costs of their actions. All the mechanisms that have been tried in history to measure these people and to make them accountable has failed, and it's failed because it is fundamentally different, I think, to the type of service and the type of system which entrepreneurs are faced with. A state bureaucrat will try and increase their power and their status by having the room where the carpet goes to the wall, by having the extra 20 employees under him or her. And if they don't think that they're progressing in the way that they should, then the temptation is, of course, that they run out of money halfway through the financial year. They send a press release to one of the television news programs, and they blame the government for underfunding their service, or for not providing enough resources, all these familiar words which even we've all known and come to love. And so, I mean, I as a state bureaucrat could have a department with 10 people under me, and I could want a bigger room, and I could want 50 people under me. And I think I would be in a dangerously powerful position if I was, for example, in the health system, to actually, if I really wanted that, to put a press release out saying, the government are underfunding me, that we're running out of resources. And this really explains why it was so difficult for people like Thatcher to actually decrease the size of the state. If you have a health system, as we do, with 1 million people in it, that's a very, very powerful voice. So really that's the fundamental difference, I think, for the new right, the libertarian right, or whatever you want to call them. That's why they put so much store by the entrepreneur and are so sceptical and pessimistic about the operations of the state bureaucrat. I think I gave an appalling answer, I'm sorry, but there we go.
Oh, no, that's good. That's pretty much covered it. Right, any other questions we want to really cover?
Bless you.
Thank you.
Are there any points you want to make, Tim? Oh, you don't want to talk at all about Czechoslovakia here? Up to you.
I just don't think it would be wise.
No, so, roll camera.
And rolling.
Action.
As a sociologist, as an academic who's been studying these people for a number of years now, I have to say that my own profession, sociologists, are increasingly seeing the influence of traditional classical liberal or modern libertarian ideas. There are many sociologists I could name in Britain who are well versed in these ideas, and I think are very sympathetic or overtly supportive of them. I'm thinking of people like Professor Peter Saunders, who used to be a Trotskyist, of course, and today is a leading supporter or sympathiser with the new right. I'm looking at people like Dr. Dennis O'Keefe, Professor David Marsland, the professor who won the Thatcher Award this year, is a sociologist. This would have been remarkable 10 or 20 years ago, especially at the LSE, which is the institution that I've been studying at now for a number of years. So I do think that it's important to understand that these ideas are not just influencing a small number of people in party politics. The importance about this movement is it's far broader than that, and it covers people who cover an amazingly diffuse and diverse range of areas. It's not just academic sociologists, it's not just politicians, it's not just researchers in groups that are not directly associated with political parties like the Adam Smith Institute or the Institute of Economic Affairs, but it's also it's got a lot of supporters in the music industry, in video production. There are lots of people I know in that who are supportive of it, and it goes on. There are artists I know. I think if you could name any profession, I would know somebody in it, or quite a number of people in the profession who now hold these ideas. Back in the early 1970s, there were perhaps a few score people who were espousing radical free market ideas. Today, there are hundreds and thousands in this movement, and they have got to such a stage where I think we are seeing, very much with their influence, the demise of the traditional left and right dichotomy. I hate telephones, don't you?
They help out. Should we get that? Do you want to get that, Philip? If you don't mind, thanks.
Isn't Chris in?
He is, yeah. He's dozing out.
He's got it. Probably Brian.
Brian wants to know when you guys are going to be eating.
Oh,
we'll be down there about
pretty soon. I mean, we're just going to come to a close now.
We'll be there at about
So
7
we'll
o'clock.
Be there about 7 o'clock. Does Brian want to come to the
Yeah,
quiz?
I think he wants to.
That'd be great.
Do you want to work with him?
Yes, I'll work with him.